as well as feminist research methods. Today's event will be recorded and posted on IAFI's YouTube channel. It's also a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so just a friendly reminder to please keep yourself muted. And we will have Q&A at the end of the event, in which we will invite you to raise your hand using the raise hand function to ask questions. Please also feel free to put questions, comments, and share any resources in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator of today's event, Radhika Bala Krishna, Professor of the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Radhika, over to you.
Thank you so much. And before we start, I want to really thank Mary for doing all the legwork and pulling this together. Would not have happened without her. So first, to thank her. This panel is building on a panel that we did at the annual conference last year, the Quito conference. And again, an attempt, as Jessica just said, to bring academics, activists, practitioners together to think about how we share our knowledge and experience, both in terms of having academic research become more pertinent to the work that people are doing on the ground, and also for knowledge dissemination, and for academic research to be really shaped by what people are doing on the ground as well, so that we're not academics just talking to each other, but it's a conversation. So I'm very excited that this is the second one that I've been a part of, and I know that the online committee has had another panel. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce the panel of speakers today. Laura Alfers, Director of the Social Protection Program from Women in the Informal Employment and Globalization Organization, WeGo. Mary Borman, who's the economist, International Center for Research on Women. James Hines, the Andrew Glynn Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts. Gabby Ore Aguilar, the Program Officer at Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and Corina Rodriguez Enriquez, Researcher, Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Public Policy, and the Executive Member for Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Dawn. So that's our panel. And so I'm going to start with asking each of the panelists different questions. So I'll start with asking James Hines, and you have 6 minutes to respond to the question. James, we've worked together for a long time and have included collaborations on macroeconomic academics and trainings for activists, UN officials. I mean, so many different things that we've done around the world, across the globe, including indigenous communities in the US. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on those experiences, including challenges and what is necessary to translate academic content so that it was practical for these audiences. And what type of capacity building do you think are essential, both for activists and for academics, IAFI members, so that we're more effectively working together to support common goals?
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Yeah, we've been doing these types of workshops on economic literacy for, I don't know, 15 years now in a wide range of contexts. A lot of what we had done had been US focused, working with activists within the United States, but we've also done workshops at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, in Cairo for MENA regional activists, in Johannesburg for women's rights activists throughout the African continent. So a large number of different contexts. And the focus of all these workshops has been what we've kind of talked about is economic literacy, kind of building a better understanding of economic ideas, concepts, and providing alternative frameworks for people. I would say that kind of the overarching goal of this work hasn't been to train a whole bunch of activists as economists. That wasn't the intention at all, but it was to provide a larger context for their work and to help build connections across different areas of activism. Talking about the macro economy, suddenly environmental activists find common ground with union organizers, and connections are established, and kind of the scope of what they think of as their activism is enlarged in many ways. So I guess some of the lessons and kind of reflecting on what's important to keep in mind when doing this work, the things that I would say Radhika and I have learned over the years, is we've always taken a very participatory approach to these workshops, that we've kind of built on some of the ideas coming out of popular education and popular pedagogical approaches, which is really to kind of draw on the participants' own lived experiences to a large extent, and make the interactions very much not like a classroom type of interaction, but much more as kind of a dialogue and kind of a working group. But what we also recognize is that there are limitations to just relying on lived experiences as the foundation for these types of workshops, that there is a role for specialized knowledge, there is a role for expertise. So when we talk about the Federal Reserve in the US context, the lived experiences doesn't get you very far with that. Or if we're talking about financial markets, concepts around derivatives or the subprime mortgage market, all of that, there's some specialized knowledge that we bring. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, but also to acknowledge all the types of specialized knowledge, the types of expertise in the room. We bring certain types of knowledge as economists, but all the activists also have a lot to offer us, and we have to listen to that and learn from that. And it's actually a skill you have to develop over time. And for those of us who are used to classroom teaching, it's a very different type of way of engaging with people. A part of the importance of this is that it's also important for the academics, Radhika and I, to always listen and be adaptable and be willing to kind of change things in mid-course. So I'll just give you one example. It's one of my favorite examples of this, of a workshop that we did. This was just outside Washington, D.C., that had a large number of activists from indigenous communities within in the US. And we had developed a whole economic literacy program that really introduced the idea of neoliberalism, neoliberal policies, and wanted to develop a critique of these policies, including thinking about a bigger role for the state in terms of managing and regulating the economy. Which is, a type of economic literacy workshop that we had done many times. So we're very kind of used to the way that we had structured this. But when we talked about the role of the state, suddenly we realized that all the indigenous activists had they were almost hostile, or they were resistant to how we were approaching this. And we were unsure what was going on until, we got to a point, just by listening and communicating, where they told us that, through their experiences and their activism, the state is actually the enemy. It wasn't really the agent of progressive change. And so we had to rethink how we didn't really change the content in terms of, the critique of neoliberalism, but really had to problematize the way we thought about the state, and how we thought about organizing and resisting on neoliberalism. And so that was a major lesson. And it's that type of adaptability, listening, and recognizing the expertise and lived experiences of people in the room that I think is really important when you're doing these types of capacity building, economic literacy types of workshops. Now, in terms of challenges, the things that I don't think we've done very well, but I think there's scope for doing this. is kind of long-term relation. I put it in the category long-term relationship building, that a lot of the workshops we've done are kind of one-off workshops, that there's not a lot of sustained involvement after those workshops. In some cases, activists bring back what they've learned to their organizations, and they develop a way of sustaining the work within the organizations. In other cases, that doesn't necessarily happen. But I think long-term relationship building is a really important component of the relationship between activists and academics. And it's one area that I think we could have done a lot better in terms of this work. Now, one reason why we haven't done it is it's largely been Radhika and myself and some other IAFI colleagues like Diane Elson on occasion doing these workshops. So we ourselves do not have the capacity to kind of engage in all these sustained relationship of building. But it's an important component of this type of work. And it's something that I think if we thought about it more systematically and thought about a project where we had not just Radhika and I doing this type of work, but a larger collective doing this type of work, where we could actually build those sustained relationships, it would be very useful. What the form this would take, I don't know, whether it's just more people engaged in this type of economic literacy work, whether it's doing things like train the trainers, get the organizations themselves to build the capacity to sustain this work, or just follow up workshops that explicitly focus not necessarily on the economic literacy piece, but on how to sustain this over time. There's lots of options, but I think that's an important area that could be worked on moving forward. And I am out of time.
You are. Thanks, James. I'm going to now turn to Corina. Corina, you've for years worked as an academic economist and a member of DAWN in these roles. What do you say are important ways that collaboration has worked, and what are some of the obstacles of working together with activists, especially in the Global South? And you have, as a member of DAWN, you have long-term experience on running summer schools. And so what kind of insights can you share with us about your experience doing that, and also building on the conversation we had last summer, because you had quite a bit to talk about in terms of what IAFI's role could be. So that would be great as well.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thanks a lot to IAFI for inviting me to continue this conversation. The first thing I would like to say is that as a feminist academic, my work only makes sense when it is part of a political project. So I think in our own work, the boundaries between academia, activism, and advocacy are pretty blurred. And it is all, so we ourselves also have many hats as academic and as activists and advocates, but also to work with activists and advocates is very crucial to the meaning of our work. So I think working with activists is food for our work, and dialogue and collective action is fundamental. And for me, working with activists and being an activist myself helps me to find the relevant research questions and problems. So I think a way to build these bridges and to make these collective efforts has to do with look for our own research interests, questions, and problems into the field, to be very open and very attentive to listening, to capture from the experiences in the ground, from people's own words, our own questions, our own research questions. And I would also like to pick on what James also said about these dialogues being dialogues. It's not that we have something to teach activists or advocates. There is so much that there is there for us to learn from them. So I think the approach has to be this one, to think about this as dialogue and not as teaching. We are teaching, they are learning. And I think it's very important to align our research project with activist agendas. I think our research projects should feed evidence analysis to support these political resistances, these political agendas, including providing ideas for actions. I think it's also important that we think about our research not only in a way to produce evidence or analysis, but also to think about how this can be translated into concrete political actions. And I think that we are, with this approach and with this kind of frame setting, then there are some tensions because the political agenda is not the same as the academic agenda. And then we are in this tension between producing for our academic career and producing for what is relevant for political actions. So I think many times the interest of research funders, I'm very happy Gabi is here because, you know, the role of funders is relevant, and many times funders who fund projects that would help activists are not the same that fund research projects. So there are also tensions there, and of course the issues and approaches that the journals value many times are not the one on the political agenda. So I think we need to navigate this tension, but we are feminists. So we are, it is in our essence to challenge these mainstream approaches. So I think we need to, there is a world of journals out there, so we need to go and find a place where our research interests can be disseminated. And I think we should also always work with this like double vision to produce in a format that would feed our academic career, but the same material to be framed in a format that would be useful for activism and advocacy. And in this sense, I think it's very important that we work together with people that can help us translate our research work into these different formats. In your question, you raised the issue of my experience from the Global South, and I wonder whether there is any specific issue of doing this from the Global South. I think maybe in the Global South it's easier in the way that, you know, the producing knowledge is always political, and in the Global South this is so clear, and I think we are wearing these many hats at the same time. And because I have only one remaining minute, I will go to the question on the summer schools. Yes, at Dawn we developed these Dawn training institutes. We have done so for many years, and it's a great experience. It's a training that bring together people for intensive training for 3 weeks, people from all around the Global South in a location. It was in presence, and I would highlight that it's important to bring people from different places, from different experiences, from different backgrounds. And these trainings were not only focused on economic, but it was interdisciplinary. And I think this is something that is also very, very needed to produce relevant research. And I think we are now, and I'll finish with this, facing new challenges. Our last Dawn Training Institute was cancelled because of the pandemic. So now we are thinking about what format can we find that we can keep on organizing this kind of summer schools, maybe in an hybrid mode, or I think we have new challenges to face in this thinking about how to do academic work and activism and advocacy at the same time. Thank you.
Karina, thank you so much. You know, it's hard for me to only be the facilitator because I have so much to say myself. But one of the things that I just wanted to throw out is the trainings that James and I did in the US, and it was right before the elections. One of the methodology that we did in that is that I actually interviewed about 35 activists and asked them, if you had a training on macroeconomics, what is it that you want to know? And that shaped the training. And that made a total difference in what we covered instead of the two of us deciding what activists need to know. So that's also just a methodological thing for us to think about. So next is Laura. Laura, your work at WeGo took you to past IAFE conferences, but finding that the type of research useful to your work wasn't being done necessarily. This led you to reach out to specific feminist economists and bring them on board to support your work on social protection. What can you share with us about the type of research that's relevant for your work that isn't being done by academics? And what are the processes like building these bridges yourself? And what do you see as necessary to build more sustained relationships moving forward? And I think this also goes to what James and Karina have already said about building these relationships. So please, Laura.
Thanks, Radhika. Yeah, I should probably start by saying that I think that there are people doing the type of research we need, but it's about making the connections closer. So I'll reflect more on what I think the challenges are in sort of making those connections, as well as some of the questions about sustaining the work. WeGo as an organization, I mean, we have two major aims through research to challenge harmful narratives and assumptions, which are the basis for the kinds of policies which either exclude or adversely incorporate workers in the informal economy. And then to support grassroots organizations of informal workers themselves to engage policymakers to put forward their own arguments, to represent themselves in arguing for policy change. And both of these aims require research, but it's not necessarily the type of research that always excites academics. And I think Karina alluded to that with the sort of, you know, what are the incentives for academics versus what are the incentives for grassroots organizations? Sometimes it's pretty basic work. You know, it's not necessarily at the leading edge of econometrics. Sometimes it's work that doesn't fit neatly into disciplinary boundaries. Sometimes it upsets too many existing ways of understanding and doing for it to actually gain much traction amongst academics who are incentivized to publish in particular disciplinary journals and so on. But focusing on the issue of like the sort of relative basicness of some of the work that needs to be done, I think that is one of the issues that we've come up against, and I think is at the core of some of the lack of connection that we've had in the past. There are two or three areas which I think engagements with academic economists for our work can be super useful. So, for example, we are engaged in a project at the moment on social protection, really trying to understand some of the economic assumptions that lead to the types of policies we think that are going to adversely include informal workers, right? So they sort of lead social protection systems that aren't particularly inclusive or disadvantage informal workers by making them pay too much to access them. And what we realized was that a lot of the social protection discussion was taking place in the world of social protection, and most people in social protection are not necessarily trained economists and don't understand that actually there's a whole lot of economic assumptions that are underlying the big policy debates, and people don't understand what we're really debating about because we're not actually getting to the core of it. So, for example, some of the big debates are actually, and this is, I've come to this realization after James has been involved in some of our work, are about, how we understand the functioning of labor markets, and whether we see them as perfect or as distorted, in their natural state. And, that isn't something that gets discussed in the world of social protection policy, which is much more focused on, design of this kind of policy and design of this kind of program. But so much of what we're talking about actually comes from this, how do we understand labor markets and how how they function. So I think there's a really important role for academic economists to come in and help us clarify that, and like help us get to these root sort of causes of the debate and discussion so that we are more powerful in how we are able to address them. When certain powerful policy actors come up with kind of fairly ridiculous social protection sort of policy prescriptions, it's coming from a place of understanding how labor markets function or about the role of social protection in economic growth and so on. And having that sort of clear understanding of what's underlying these policies, I think is really important. A second area that I think where sort of economics academia is really helpful is on the data side. So again, in social protection, there's a whole thread of work on the idea that certain types of social protection actually drive informality, right? That informality is not necessarily caused by structural economic conditions, but social protection systems themselves can cause informality. And that's a very, very powerful policy idea. It was the basis of the 2021 UNDP Human Development Report, right? But it's actually a theory that's based on very weak data. So, we've now approaching academics to sort of work on exposing how weak that data actually is, because in the policy world, we don't hear this is what we found, and actually the findings were very weak. It's just this is what we found. And it becomes the basis for entire policy prescriptions. So again, there's a role to kind of unpick that data and really reveal exactly how weak the findings were. But again, where we've had to sort of really convince economists to come on board is because this isn't exciting econometric stuff, right? This is pretty basic, and it's not necessarily going to get you into the leading journals. And so we've had to do some convincing and kind of really explaining why in policy terms it's actually important that we have this, that we do this work. I think thirdly, there's another role to sort of help connect the dots, and I think this has already been mentioned around the micro and the macro. James mentioned this, around people's stories and lived experiences. So we spend a lot of time documenting the kind of micro world of the informal economy. But I think what's missing is how we translate that and how we connect it up with the macro debates in economics, as well as the technical debates in economics, right? So I think that's a lot about what I'm talking about. And I think there's a huge role to work with academic economists there as well, in terms of that translation of the micro and the macro. The technical and the lived experience are really, really important. And then I think it's where the role of organizations like WeGo comes in, where we sort of are a bridging organization. We do have academics and researchers in our midst, as well as organizations of informal workers, but our speciality is really being the bridge. So translating the work into worker materials. There are organizations that play that bridging role as well, and we have specializations in how can we communicate this to informal worker organizations, or how can we take this type of research methodology. I mean, not all research methodologies are possible. It's not possible to do this with all research methodologies, but there are ways to say, well, how can a well-established membership-based organization of informal workers learn how to do this better themselves? And I think there are ways to do that too, for certain types of work. And I think, taking it forward, I would say that I don't want to say it's just about talking, but more spaces for dialogue like this are important. And I think but it might be better to take it, it might be that we take it a step forward and actually bring the membership-based organizations of workers or whoever we're working with into the conversation more explicitly. They would, and then we'd have to structure it very carefully, right? It's not just a conversation, of people who are trained to talk in these kinds of forums. It's people who are trained to, talk in very different ways. And so I think there's a discussion there about how we talk about the issues, which I can pick up later. Thanks, Radhika.
Thank you so much. There's so much going on here in terms of who's an academic what is academic research? You know, as Karina said, we all wear many hats. And so, you know, how do we negotiate all these different hats and what the academy values, which is, I think, the big thing that we need to challenge in some ways. Mary, you're next. In your role as an economist at ICRW, you sit at the technical lead of a new global coalition on women's economic empowerment that has within its membership civil society and a few academic institutions. The mission for that coalition includes integrating evidence from lived experience with more traditional research in building and utilizing evidence base. What reflections can you share with us about the evaluation of different types of knowledge and integrating those within the context of global coalition building? And what needs do you see for collaboration with feminist economic academics and global advocacy spaces to achieve feminist economic goals? I think that's a very nice end that I think each person has brought up, is that the reason we're doing this is for creating feminist goals. So how do we do that? Mary, over to you.
Exactly. And thank you so much, Radhika, and to my fellow panelists today. So for context, we just launched our Global Coalition for Women's Economic Empowerment. We prosper at CSW. So we're a new player in the global space. That we have over 40 members from grassroots organizations, international NGOs, to private sector, to some university departments, focusing on women's economic empowerment research, including the University of Kenyatta in Kabianga in Kenya. So our steering committee is really strong and reflects this diversity, but we're really just at the process of collating data and evidence on key thematic areas within the coalition and kind of doing just what Laura was talking about. How are we bringing together like lived experiences with some of this more, technical knowledge? And so as the technical lead, I think a lot about the valuations of different types of knowledge, especially as a US-based feminist economist. I'm very aware of where I sit and wanting to be inclusive. So how do we break down some of the hierarchies in value, in terms of different types of knowledge and evidence to embody inclusive values, and also giving thought to how we weave these pieces together? I think that's a really interesting puzzle. And how do we do that in a way that is effective for our advocacy goals as well? Again, how are we translating this to be effective to our audiences? I think about these different types of knowledge as like pieces of a puzzle to put together to flesh out the landscape, but I think the actual process will be both interesting and challenging, especially, as I said, in advocating to different targets, right, and different audiences. My hope within our technical working group, I think the focus is on this, is to create a really collaborative process, which requires, I think, a lot of intentionality and listening. But I think within a coalition, there are practical challenges in figuring out how to pull together diverse perspectives and types of evidence. And also our members are stretched. Everyone is working really hard already. There's a capacity issue in terms of how much time they can dedicate to real collaboration on these efforts in addition to their own work. And I think, that's a real thing to think about and take forward. As others have mentioned, I think that there are a lot of coalitions and organizations out there that I think are approaching this, bringing these different types of evidence and knowledge together in really effective ways. Though what we've been hearing from policymakers, civil society and multilateral organizations, is that there is still a need to tie in the academic piece in a more systematic way for advocacy, particularly in translating that type of research for policy and integrating it with the really practical, like on the ground programmatic components and evidence from realities. So, as my other panelists have said, there's some work to be done here. And my hope, within the coalition, is that this can be a real area of potential contribution. But working in the women's economic empowerment global space, and coming from a feminist economic background, from my undergrad to my PhD, I have such a want to connect the coalition more to feminist economists and feminist economic thought. I think, women's economic empowerment is defined in many different ways in the global space, and often in narrow ways that I don't think foster the types of approaches, policies, and change needed to achieve broader feminist economic goals, particularly in promoting individualistic approaches that ignore the larger kind of macroeconomic context. And Laura was getting to this, not considering rights issues and quality of work, and addressing barriers and these kind of structural components more generally. So, but I also see openings, I think, in the global advocacy space and opportunities to expand the lens and the dialogue. So it's definitely been like a passion and a motivation for me to create and be a part of these types of conversations that we're having today. But I think there's so much want and need for evidence-based insights on many of these critical issues in the global advocacy landscape. And the rigorous kind of feminist, economic, academic, both like the theoretical perspectives, right, that Laura's getting to, like what's the base theories, how can we challenge those assumptions, empirical work, and also modeling is a critical piece of what makes the case to policymakers, you know, and we're really hearing that there's a want from funders, from policymakers about like, what is the evidence, what works? And so I think that there's a really critical piece or critical role for academic research there. And, you know, and I'm not alone in wanting to create these connections to feminist economists. Sitting in my current position, I regularly hear from those in civil society the desire to know how to access the research of and work with feminist economists. And it feels like there is just this gap between the realms, right? There's this kind of inaccessibility. And I think there's also that people feel intimidated from civil society and how to reach out to academics and create these connections. There's this kind of hierarchy and sense of, you know, within this knowledge and expertise and specialized knowledge. So to me, this feels like a missed opportunity, you know, and requires this broader brainstorming together about how to bridge this, which I'm grateful for today. But for example, there's so much traction on care at the moment, and I've heard the desire from grassroots and local orgs to figure out how to incorporate the modeling and economic analysis being done by academics and, you know, institutions like the ILO to their contexts. You know, how do we take that work down to the local to support their strategies? But even at the global level, you know, the Global Alliance for Care, a representative of which was at the previous online event in this series, they're eager to engage with academics. You know, there are many areas that they want that knowledge and research support. I've also recently heard great interest from civil society to collaborate with feminist economists around the new IMF gender strategy. So there's just so much interest, and I see tremendous value in collaboration, right? From global advocacy down to supporting the advocacy of grassroots and local organizations across many different contexts. And to what my other, you know, panelists have said as well, I think it's particularly the kind of the macroeconomic, the trade, the international political economy, these kind of big picture, context setting, rules of the game, determining factors that are really critical to continue to develop knowledge sharing and collaboration. As these are areas of knowledge, I think, as James is saying, that are generally more developed within academic study and less accessible within civil society contexts. And, you know, this is a generalization, as again, there are organizations and coalitions doing amazing work on this, but I think it's not as widespread, this knowledge, right? And I think driving change in these aspects is so fundamental to being able to achieve other goals of gender and economic justice and rights, right? That these things like these macroeconomic academies and other pieces are really important and essential to share knowledge and foster collaboration. And so just to wrap up, I think, yeah, given all this, my brain turns to like questions of what are the constraints and barriers and how do we take this forward? So I'll end there as I know I'm out of time and we can get to that a little bit later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mary. I mean, there's so much going on here that it's like we need about, you know, a retreat for 2 days to really figure this out, because it's about what the academy values, and that's a big hindrance for people to do this work, is because your dean doesn't really care what you're doing in terms of social policy. They're like, where's the referee journal article that, you know, I can show? And so I think we need to think about it in multiple ways. Gabby, you're here as a funder, but I've known you a long time, and you've been an activist and worked as an NGO for a long time. So I would like you to have both hats on when you're talking about this, not only that of a donor. Building sustained relationship across sectors and co-creating research projects has a very practical funding component for ensuring diverse representation and capacity, both for activists and for academics who are otherwise volunteering their time on top of a full-time job. I think that's a really important question. Given your role now as a funder, what reflections and insights can you share with us about what is needed to support these efforts? And do you think there's an appetite from donors for funding these types of efforts? And if not, what do you think could generate this, especially given the huge potential to create change from cross-sector collaboration? Over to you.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you for inviting me. And I always wear my two hats, Radhika. So, so thank you for the question. I think I will reflect on three strategies that, from my experience as grantmaker, are key to building sustained relationships between academics and activists. The first strategy is to support, and it's been said here already, the creation of spaces for systematic and consistent exchange. For funders, this really means going beyond the focus on thematic outcomes and results to provide funding that generates the conditions that enable these communities of practice to connect, to co-create, to exchange, or simply to share knowledge, right? For example, last year, Wellspring organized a series of dialogues bringing together advocates and feminist economists to discuss gender issues in the context of the pandemic. This was not thought of as a space for cross-sectoral exchange. However, in a survey after the dialogues, one of the key asks from participants was for Wellspring to continue sustaining that type of spaces for that specific cross-sectoral dialogues. So we proactively sought the collaboration of an organization dedicated to promote exchanges and between funders, academics, and movements, and provided a grant for this organization to host these dialogues, to move forward this exchange for 2 more years. Whether that conversation results in a research or advocacy agenda is really up to the groups involved. Our role as funder is really to support and to sustain these types of spaces so that the exchanges between academics and advocates can continue. A second strategy is to support the efforts and commitments of academic organizations to build relationships of trust with advocates and movements. This means supporting academics' efforts to serve in boards of NGOs, to provide advice, training to activists, to enrich the academic debate by bringing representatives of activism and movements to academic spaces. And all these efforts really contribute to developing long-lasting relationships of trust, not only between individual researchers and the advocates, but also trust in the research institution involved. In this regard, when we assess support for research initiatives led by an academic institution, we look at whether this has a strong connection to policy advocacy or campaign activists, and the extent to which that research is informed by the gaps and the needs identified by their advocacy partners. For example, we're supporting a university based in the north to implement a multi-country study on taxation and gender in various countries in the south. And this is led by an academic who sits in the board of global campaigns based in the south, is an advisor to global NGOs that lead policy efforts for fair taxation, etc. And the ways in which that research is conceived is that it not only reflects and looks at the gaps in evidence on information identified by the university and the academic partners, but also looks at the different gaps in advocacy and the gaps in knowledge that the campaign activists and organizations have identified. And so that research would allow them to advocate before the UN mechanisms at the local level, etc. We're also supporting research initiatives implemented by networks that have both academics and activists among their members. In these cases, the relationship of trusts already exists across the membership of the network. So that ensures that the knowledge produced is really knowledge that is needed, that, as Corina was saying, is part of a political process that strengthens the network's campaign and advocacy. So Dawn is really a notable example of that type of network. To enhance support for building relationship of trusts between academics and activists, it's really important that funders understand the value of supporting research projects within a time frame that allow researchers and activists to have enough time and space to learn about each other's vision, narratives, context. This of course has implications, financial implications that need to be taken into account. And the third strategy to build the sustained relationships, in my view, is to consider the power dynamics between researchers and activists from the global south. that are either collaborators or targets of the research, right? At a time when there's increasing debate and reflection about the implications of decolonizing approaches to grant making, it's really critical for funders to avoid perpetuating, those power dynamics. And so not just between North and South, but also between different types of knowledge and practices. So an important aspect of research projects that we're assessing more intentionally now is the level of involvement and decision-making that the local partners have in the framing, in the process, and the distribution of resources. Academic organizations or academic think tanks who have the relationship with funders hardly ever involved the country level advocacy partner in the negotiation of the grant. So it's really the responsibility of funders to make sure that the activists based in the South who are participating in the study as data collectors or organizing validation exercises, etc., are fairly compensated, that their views and their opinions are taken into account, that dissemination is done of the research is done in a way that contributes to their local objectives. But all that has been said, and I just want to finalize by highlighting. Well, there's another question that I was thinking of addressing at the second round. Radhika, I don't know how I'm going with my time.
Gabby, if you want, I was going to do the next round. So
Yes.
You're out of time on this one, but do you want to just start by taking over the next round?
No, I can stop here. I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a whole generation of academics and intellectual activists who are here around this table as well. So I think funders need to be more exposed to these experiences and support and solidify that cross-sectoral work. So I will keep my answers to the other question for the other round, I think. And thank you. And sorry for that.
Thank you so much, Gabby. So we've had this conversation here, and as I said, we've had these conversations in many places, and my 30 years of working with IAFI, so many conferences where activists and NGOs come, and then there's this attempted collaboration, and then a few of us who are wearing the both hats end up being the ones who collaborate, and then there's others who don't. And so I want to kind of pull us together to take away from the kind of general comment about how do academics and activists collaborate to how can IAFI as feminist economists, it's not, because we're not talking just any academic, we're talking about feminist academics. So how do we kind of build this into something that maybe IAFI as an institution can do? I think having these NGOs like WeGo that pull us together somehow might be an answer. And so I just want all of you to reflect on bringing it a little bit to IAFI and saying what do feminist academics and feminist economists, how do we do this work in a way that is sustainable and not a one-off, which many of us have done, and James and we've all done this, and then as James said, how do we keep it going? Because we all have full-time jobs, and this is on top of our full-time jobs. So I'm going to start with you, Karina, because you've had also a long-term experience doing this and negotiating these places, and we each have 3 minutes, so not that long. So really recommendations and also what are the barriers? Like, what are the things that we need to overcome to be able to do this?
Thanks, Radhika. I think bringing this reflection to IAFE, the first things I would like to highlight is that I think IAFE is doing this already. This IAFE, 2022 IAFE, is very different to IAFE 10 years ago. We having this conversation is an example on how we are already moving towards an institution that is more politically committed. And I think that's very, very important and bring us to a different platform where these kind of dialogues and collective building can happen. Second, I think we need to take into account that there are different types of activism as well. So we might need to make it clear to which kind of activism IAFE as an organization can build together with. Maybe it's easier for IAFE to coordinate with activism at a global level and mainly on macroeconomic issues. But I think we should need to think more carefully about how to build this collective work with people more from grassroots organizations. And I think we need to keep on promoting IAFE to lose the, not to be afraid of being political. I think that's the key issue. Every institution is political, even those that, you know, appear, or as we say in Spanish, se autoperciben. They perceive themselves as being, you know, just scientific, as if producing knowledge is not political. No? So I think we need to keep on pushing this attitude to understand that we are, as any institution, political, and we need to commit very urgently with political action.
Thank you, Karina. I completely agree. I think we need to bring that word political back into the meaning of research. I will now go to Mary. I mean, because you're now at ICRW, you're also an academic, and we've been talking about this for the last few months. So tell me what you think we need to do to kind of move this engagement to a different level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, I think to a certain extent, like the appetite, right? To gauge, like, how do we start kind of like pulling like IAFE members and academics, like to gauge their interest, right? And like appetite for this, and then kind of build capacity. I think, you know, James had some good thoughts there. And I think the idea of having like listening and learning sessions, right? Bringing together different groups, maybe around thematic issues, you know, kind of breaking it out, because this is such a broad umbrella, right? Activism could be so many things. And so how do we start identifying kind of like key issues and generating like learning and listening sessions across sectors? And I think then how do we bring in the funders to that conversation, have them be at the table as well to kind of, you know, get that interest going and create the potential there? Because I think it is difficult for academics and activists, right? Like everyone, I think, works really hard. And I think all IAFE members really, really do. And I think there is a deep want, or I assume, to kind of be political. I think, you know, feminist economics in itself, I feel like, is political, just the content, but there needs to be like funding for capacity. And so I think it needs to be kind of like all of those different pieces, right? Gauging the interest, coming together around key issues, and then with these kind of listening sessions, and then bringing the funders in too. So we have all of the people at the table to start generating maybe like some pilot type programs almost around something. And maybe that's the macroeconomic kind of workshops and learning sessions, and taking those forward. Maybe it's something different. You know, I know that, as I said, there's a lot happening within care. And so there's a lot of interest around that, but it could be social protection as well. I'm not sure, but just kind of an idea of how we could take the next step, I think, from my end.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to go to Laura next, having been at the intersection of working with academics and activists, and what would you suggest?
So I really like Karina brought up the point of bringing in more perhaps bringing in more grassroots organizations as well into the dialogue spaces. And I really liked Mary's sort of let's get more specific, because this is, as she says, this huge area of work. It could be anything we're talking about. And the idea of listening. And I think that is really something very nice and concrete to build on. I think what needs to be considered is the issue, you know, if we're addressing the sort of power differentials that potentially would exist is the issue of language, and to think very carefully about that, right? So not just, okay, so there's the disciplinary language. If we're thinking of economics, there's an entire jargon that goes with it, which can be highly exclusionary and very difficult for people outside of economics to understand. So being very careful about how we frame things in terms of the disciplinary language, but also around, the languages that people speak. We at WeGo spend a lot of time on money on translation. If somebody wants to speak in Swahili or Gujarati, they should be able to speak in Swahili or Gujarati at the table, right? And that should be enabled and facilitated in the spaces. So I think just coming from our experience, that's hugely important, that issue around language and how that can sort of help to keep the power differential more balanced within these spaces. One question I have, and I don't have the answer to it, is the extent to which, we're talking about allies here. I mean, IAFI is certainly, we would consider allies in the sort of economic space, but whether and how to connect with these academics who you say don't connect or are not allies, and to the extent with which there is any purpose in doing that. For example, WeGo had tried for years to try and influence the thinking of powerful academic economists, who come from the orthodox world of economics, through exposure dialogue programs with Sewa in India, bringing them to live and work with informal workers and then having a dialogue around that. To what extent has this challenged your theoretical position, your economic theory? And we came to the conclusion that this hadn't done anything, that nothing had shifted as a result. So is this a waste of energy? Because I think it's an important strategic question. Is this a waste of energy and resources? Or do we focus on establishing the alternative evidence base? And that's what we do. But I think it's certainly something that, it's a strategic decision to make. And if it is taken on, it needs more than one organization doing it, right? It needs a lot of people working on it and doing it together. And so I think it's perhaps another important point to discuss collaboratively. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Laura. James, I saw you smiling while she was speaking, so I'm going to go to you next because I feel like you have something to say.
No, I just know a lot about the exposure dialogues that Laura has talked about and some of the people involved. In terms of IAFI, three things just jumped to my mind. One is that, IAFI has for a long time talked about starting an IAFI summer school. And often what we've talked about is, providing a space for early career academics who want to work in feminist economics and gear the summer school towards that audience. But we could reconceptualize that whole idea as a space, where academics and activists come together and actually work on these issues, some capacity building on both sides there. So that's one thing I think IAFI could do fairly easily with the appropriate organization and support. Also, IAFI, IAFI is one of its one of the things that's really valuable about IAFI is the people. I mean, it's an incredible network of people who are very politically motivated. So there's a resource there of academics who could be linked to activism, but we don't. We kind of let the individual IAFI members sort that out, but maybe IAFI could do some type of coordinating role where there's different academics who specialize in different areas that we could link to activist groups and they could make a formal request to do that. Now, I know a lot of organizations have done this in the past, and the problem is that they link someone and they send out an email and that's the end of it. So there's no real support for the relationship building. So I think that we'd have to think really carefully, not just have a registry of feminist economists and send out names, but how to actually do that effectively. And my last observation is that we've talked about the conflict between pursuing activist work and then having an academic a career, kind of the publication and what counts as a publication. And we've talked about academics in general, but I think it's far, far, far worse when we talk about economics than all different academic disciplines. That economics, more so than probably any social science discipline, really defines what is acceptable research on very ideological grounds, and it's a deeply, deeply political struggle with respect to that. And I will recognize that IAFI has created a space to challenge that for people who want to work on feminist economics issues. The creation of the journal, the fact that it's a fairly high ranked, as a publication outlet, really has allowed a lot of IAFI members to, tick all those boxes in terms of peer-reviewed publications while simultaneously being an activist. And so I think we need to acknowledge that, but maybe there's more that we could do, that IAFI, by challenging what is economics itself and what is acceptable research, is engaged in a deeply political act by doing that. And I think there's a conversation we could have about, could we go further along those lines?
Thank you, James. Listening to all of you, I was there when we first started IAFI, and it was at an ASSA meeting when a group of us were at the status of women in the economics profession, which is the only place that sort of women in economics gathered. And we walked out of that room and said, okay, it's not just about women in the economics profession, we want a feminist agenda. And it was very much, IAFI was a political agenda about feminism. And so I think we need to remember that, acknowledge that, and move forward from that. And so Gabby, I'm going to give you the last comments, and then we'll come back if there are questions as well.
Excellent. No, I like everything I'm listening about, how to make those spaces sustainable. I think my main comment is that has to be, the construction of those spaces has to be intentional, right? Because it happens usually around, discussions or thematic conversations, but it has to be a space where themes can come and go, but the space continues to be one that nurtures that relationship between, academics and activists. And I think that, IAFI has really the access to both academics, activists, and also I like the idea of bringing more movements to the table. There is appetite, I think, at this point from, at least from donors I know from the field of gender equality and human rights and women in the economy, to start, thinking about how, to support the gathering of all the research and evidence gathering to understand what happened to women in the pandemic and post-pandemic. And I think that, that is a really important context in which feminist analysis and feminist research can be a big contribution, and we could use that opportunity and that appetite for bringing this to those other spaces. And finally, I think, when I was listening to some of you that were talking about all the time and the effort that implies reaching out to activists and movements, I think that needs to be elevated in the work of researchers. That needs to be seen and visible to funders, because you sometimes take for granted that our researchers will go and to movements, and we go to advocates, and you applaud those who actually do it, and you give them the grant. But I think that has financial costs. It requires infrastructure, requires different elements, and that need to be put in front of the proposals when funders read those proposals, the research proposals. So I think it's really great that there's appetite for continuing the conversation. I think IAFI can have a space dedicated to do that with all those elements that were already put on the table. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to turn to IAFI, two of IAFI's young scholars, Riddhi Agarwal, Research Associate with Lead at Korea University, Secretary of the Young Scholars Committee of IAFI, and a member of the pre-conference committee, and Vera Acheyompong, I hope I said that right, PhD candidate in development economics at the University of Ghana, to hear their priorities and perspectives. What are specific issues and areas that young scholars to create a coordinated action around? And what reflections and thoughts do you have and what is necessary for building intergenerational bridges to connect with young scholars on key issues? And I just also wanted to say that before our main conference in Geneva, we're going to have a pre-conference that actually we have a meeting in an hour to discuss the content of that. And we're working with the young scholars to really create something that will be a half day to go through in terms of young scholars. So we are doing that, just reflecting on James's idea about a summer school. So the young scholars thing is already happening. So Riddhi, can I call on you, and Vera, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having us here, Radhika and Mary, for putting this together. My name is Radhika Agarwal. I'm from India, and I just actually returned from the field, so I have a lot of information to give about activism and research together, at least at this point for sure. But I just want to start with like a personal opinion towards activism and research coming together at some point, is that my beginning of research actually was through activism. There's a lot of young energy in college. So we used to go out and we used to work on a lot of these smaller spaces to make sure that, you know, whatever the prompt problems there are, we can resolve those issues as fast as possible. And then I came across policies and I started reading about research. And then I got the opportunity of going on the field and actually conducting in our city with one of the lead PIs. Now, the main common ground I found between the two, activism and research, is that both require you to have the experience of the voices on the field. So it's not just the overarching experience that you have. It's not the overarching, let's say, the labor force participation that we're talking about. We're actually talking about people, and how Radhika and James, the training that you worked on for activists, right? The idea of talking to them first to make the curriculum, that's exactly what we're doing on the field at the moment. But the difference I find between activism and research is the pace of how the change takes place. And it's also the magnitude of how the change is taking place. So my first question, and this is as a very, very young scholar, not a PhD candidate, a very young scholar, is that I see there is a lot of change that we can see through research in academia, but it's a very paced, steady social change that we're looking at. And it's more systemic, but activism is more rooted into the ground realities, and it's something that you observe on an actual ongoing basis, right? So how do we bring the values of activism into academia to make sure that like the fire of young scholars or the young spirits remains ignited while we are actually doing the work? Because most of the time it's just the frustration of the fact that what we're doing right now might not actually translate into a bigger, larger change. And this is very specific to feminist economics, because that in itself is a slower change that we experience, right? Care economy in itself, very, very slow recognition of the work that we are doing. So, but in activism, there's a lot of, it's very loud, it's very out there. How do you bring that synergy between academia and activism together? That's sort of the first question that I have. And the next one that I want to pose, and this is almost from like the Young Scholar Committee itself, Vera will speak about what we are looking forward to as support from IAFE and the other scholars that are out there who are willing to help out young scholars get out there into the field more. But I want to ask, what can the young scholars do more? What is it that is something that the senior scholars or the activists who've been working in this field for a long time or very experienced think that the young scholars sort of are lacking at the moment? and what is it that we can work towards? Where do we find a point of intersection between our learnings and the learnings that have already existed before? I'm going to hand over to Vera to talk about the other aspects of support that we require.
Okay, so my name is Vera. I'm taking up from where we ended. So I'm just thinking that as a PhD candidate and a young researcher, I have a low incentive to want to embark on to go into activism. And this is because there's already so much pressure on a young scholar to want to publish before graduating. And so activism and all the stress that comes with it, particularly if you're a woman, where we have most of the activism in developing countries and the global south, having some political underpinnings. Your focus now as a young scholar and a woman is to have the right journals, right publications in the right journals. So it makes it difficult, or it doesn't make activism a bit more attractive for us as young scholars to want to go in. Even though, like Rihi said, in undergraduate, high school, most of us were active. We were all out for that because it came with a lot of energy. But going forward into graduate school, we realize that it's not always about going all out. Maybe because we've not met the right people to guide us, to guide that energy, to get us what we want to see. And of course, IAFI has started right with us. Like James mentioned, the IAFI Academy, the summer school coming up, it's good. And I think, like he said, already initially the plan was to groom young people into feminist economics. Now bringing in activism should be a great idea for us. So it will not just be learning feminist economics, but now going to have a good place to channel that energy, youthful energy we have, into doing meaningful research that affects people. Again, the issues of mentorship, which has started, again, done by IAFI, has been very good. And we've met a lot of experienced researchers who are guiding us. However, the challenge is most of the guidance has been related to just research and not activism. Maybe we don't have to go back to the drawing board and restructure the original idea behind the mentorship. Because again, like you said, we have a lot of energy. We want to go all out there to pour that energy into something meaningful. So if we're able to restructure the whole idea behind the mentorship, the summer school, maybe it will be good. And again, with the Feminist Economics Journal, it's good. And we know that the extent to which, as young scholars and as researchers, we can impact any policy or have any social changes through our publications. And whilst that is the case, like Rihi said, most of us don't know what we are not doing right. Because you'd write the paper, you think it is so good, and then you send, and then you wait for 3 months, 4 months, only to get, we are sorry to inform you we could not accept this. Then you ask yourself, what am I not doing right? So maybe it's about time that we have a lot of you, since we are here, this program, a good platform for us to interact with researchers, activists, and those, of course, doing the two at the same time. The right opportunity for us to learn. And then, like he said, tell us what we are not doing right. Maybe you can help us channel that energy, youthful energy we have, into bringing the social change we want to see. Thank you. And we are happy to be part of this program.
Thank you so much, Vera. I mean, there's so much to talk about in terms of where to go next and how we do it. I'm now going to open it up for questions from our very patient audience who's been listening to us for a long time. If you could raise your hand, or and Jihi's going to monitor them if they come on the chat. But if anyone has their hands raised, I was told that it'll show up. Okay, Isabel.
Hi, thank you. My name is Isabel Clary. I'm an anthropologist. I'm based in Haiti, where I'm also from. My lack of accent is misleading. But no, this has been really interesting for me because, as I said in the comments after Vera's intervention, is that this is one of the main reasons I never pursued a PhD. I applied, I was accepted, everything, but then I didn't pursue it because my activism and the work that I do in Haiti with working with communities I'm from Haiti, so it's even more important to me. So this is why I didn't pursue academia. And I've still interacted a lot in academic spaces, and I've always wondered, like, why there's a rigidity in the academy that really just doesn't, like Vera said, it doesn't really allow for the two things, right? And I found that I challenged that a little bit in my first master's when I was doing my thesis for anthropology. I turned my work that I was paid for into my research for the thesis. And I was able to generate very, very relevant data for both cases and come to very, very relevant conclusions for both instances, both for the academy and for the field work that I was doing for non-academic entities. So I think there was an ability to do this, or possibility. So like the organization that I ended up creating in response to this is, there's a lot of data that exists that is not applied. So private sector data, economic data that's applied in different ways for the economic bit, but private sector data, entities that do, like, for instance, there's a recycling agency here that has 10 years of recycling information. And so what we're trying to do here is channel all of this data into one place and apply it, but study it in, like, next to each other. Like, there's all this recycling. For instance, how many participants are women? Okay, so we see that they're generating this much income and they're in these areas, and we can do a lot with this kind of information. But I've had a lot of trouble generating interest or potentially funding for the research part, and also from the academy, because they want me to produce, like, I've been approached about producing articles, but the articles that they want me to produce, sometimes there's issues with, like, oh, well, you haven't cited relevant references. And I was like, okay, but I'm talking about, like, direct applied work that I just did, that, you know, I understand that there's people that came before and there's a lot of things, but then I really have to go into, like, the depths of academia to find something remotely relevant sometimes. And it's just, is it okay that there is no precedent for what we're doing now? But it's always rejected, like, okay, well, what's your theoretical framework? It's like, I feel like we're not speaking the same language anymore. So I just wanted to put that out there as something that, you know, there's a lot of things that can be done, but there's the listening circles that I think Mary was talking about. I think these are kinds of interesting opportunities where, for instance, young researchers or people like myself, we have a chance to sort of showcase what we are really doing and what we are really capable of, that can maybe bridge that knowledge divide between us and academia. Sorry, that was a very long-winded sort of way to make a comment, but.
No, thank you, Isabel. I mean, I think you remind us that, you know, knowledge production is a political process, and there's certain people that govern the idea of knowledge production and what constitutes knowledge. So we need to challenge so many things as we try to move towards certain concrete things. There's also the entire idea of what is knowledge and how do you produce it. Do I have any others who want to raise their hand? Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. I'm not feeling too well today, so I'll probably just keep my camera off now. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for such a fantastic session. I've really, really enjoyed listening to all of your ideas. I kind of have some comments and just a question, I think. So I work at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and I'm a professional staff member there who has just been accepted into a PhD program called Social Practice and Transformational Change. So it's kind of all about how research can contribute to social change and how activism and other advocacy roles and organizations can come together to really create meaningful change. And I work at an institute at the University of Guelph called the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. I don't know if anyone's heard of us, CESI for short. And my role is, for the past 8 years, has been to facilitate course-based partnerships in research and knowledge mobilization. And I wanted to say I'm really excited by what everyone is speaking about here today, because for the past 2 years, CESI's offered basically like a summer intensive, like a summer school, like you folks are talking about. And we've taken groups of students, undergrads, a lot of graduate students, and tried to build capacity for for young researchers to engage with communities. That's been in the area of conservation, that's trying to use decolonizing approaches. It's been in the area of coastal communities and food security so far. And we're starting to kind of imagine how we can kind of bring folks together in a different way, because so far it's been very academic heavy, and we haven't really been able to come up with a meaningful way for community to be involved. But I love the idea of these listening sessions, thematic based, and the idea that maybe if we do make it thematic based, that researchers, advocates, and activists, and even funders can come together to do some real relationship building in critical areas, and even maybe produce something useful and start to build those relationships where they may not have existed. So I just wanted to say I'm super excited about that. And if anyone is interested in connecting further about it, I am wide open to do that.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. The one thing I did want to point out, just in terms of especially all the young scholars and our initiative and these conversations, really has to do with Hewlett funding IAFI to be able to hire Jihi, who has, done an amazing work of all these online programs and having these committees. And so that, that was a very direct investment in IAFI to be able to build this network. And, and also the Young Scholars Initiative of the, of INET, bringing people to IAFI when we were in Glasgow. That was an amazing event. So there are very concrete things that people have invested in IAFI to do that brings up very concrete outcomes. You actually see the difference. We're sadly running out of time, and if there's one more person who has a question, please raise their hand right now. Okay, no one is. And so then I'm going to just really give it back to the panelists to give a 1-minute reflection on anything you want to say. Mary, as the person who's really carried this entire thing on your shoulders to pull together, again, I want to thank you for all the work that you did in pulling this session together. So I'll let you start with the comment.
Thank you so much, Radhika, and thank you to the young scholars and those who contributed comments. I think you brought up a lot of really valuable and interesting points. I think my last reflection is, I do hope that there's a way to bridge, as Radhika was talking about, this energy and like passion, right, within activist work with work in academia. And I think there are a lot of challenges there, right, because of what we're talking about in terms of pressure to publish and all that. So, I mean, that's a longer term change, right, that I think we would want to continue to push for within the academy. But in the short term, I am excited about, ways to, potentially take forward these next steps and bring this energy to both spaces, because I think that's part of what I love so much working in the global advocacy spaces. There is so much energy, there's so much feeling of being a part of something, but I'm also so tied and still interested in academic work. And so my hope is that we continue to take this forward with some concrete next steps. And I'm just excited to do that and to be a part of this conversation and to think about what we can build. So I'll leave it there.
And the other, one other issue that just popped in my head is that there are so few heterodox departments in economics globally, in terms of training the generation. I mean, which is great with the young scholars, but I remember most of them are in mainstream departments. So the other thing is, how do we increase the kind of heterodox places that this kind of engagement is valued? Gabby, I'm going to give it to you and see what you have to say in terms of that.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great space, Radhika, and I think IAFI is on the right path to sort of solidify this exchange and the cross-sectoral sort of collaboration and alliances. I think there's no better time than this one to solidify those relationships, precisely because of, the challenges we're confronting are so big and enormous. And I think we are really practicing, listening in this panel and the way IAFI has, put together these conversations. So I guess, it's really, I'm glad that there is shared sort of appetite for continuing this. There's also great ideas and very concrete ways in which this can move forward. And I very much welcome the presence and the participation of young scholars, and the acknowledgement that IAFI this sort of has a it occupies a political space as well, and that we are here for one reason. And I think it's sometimes we don't make it evident, but we all want a feminist economy to succeed. This is the time to push for all those efforts. So I'm really glad that I'm being part of this, and very happy to continue in the conversation and to continue listening and learning from you and contributing in any the ways we can do. So happy to continue listening in Geneva, I think.
Okay, we'll continue this in Geneva for sure. Laura?
Thanks, Radhika. And just to say a big thank you to IAFI and to Mary for bringing me into this conversation. It's been very enjoyable and good to be a part of it. I think, this at the moment, this is such a moment of possibility and a moment of threat that people are facing. We work with informal workers, and incomes have been ripped up. Debt levels are really, are sort of out of control. At the same time, there's a moment, right, where there is potential for something perhaps to be done to put a more progressive economic agenda on the table. And it's something we can seize, but I think we do need to get quite specific. And just to go back to what Mary was talking about, where are the possibilities for change, and what are the ideas that need challenging, and what do we need to do to challenge those ideas or take advantage of opportunities. I think that is the way that things can really be pushed forward in terms of the link between activism and academia, right? Because that's ultimately why this link is important, right? We want to see change. So we've got to identify really sort of concretely what that change is. And so that's just a thought going forward. Thanks.
James, I hand it to you.
Okay, thanks. I have to give a quick comment on Radhika's comment on heterodox economics departments. As currently being chair of one of the well-known heterodox economics departments, UMass Amherst, I think there's a prior question, which is how to protect these spaces that currently exist. It worries me every single day. It's such a struggle, and then we can talk about increasing them as well. But that's another conversation. I would just say, just listening to the young scholars, and the point that as you start out your career, you're under enormous pressure, to publish, get tenure, all of this. So who has time for activism? How do you prioritize that? I think I think that's an idea for the next online event or for one of these discussions among the young scholars group, because IAFI is filled with people who face similar challenges, got through, and kind of maintain kind of their political engagement. So just, talking about sharing war stories, how did you actually do that? How do you actually navigate that and provide that type of support? I think IAFI is really well positioned to help with people struggling with that question. So I'll just throw that out. And that's it for me.
Marina, you're going to close this out.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Mary, Radhika, for keeping this conversation alive. I think it's very, very important. And I think the many challenges that we have, and the many tensions, and how difficult it is to give reasonable balances between publishing and activism, it's a proof that it's also important that we build community, and this being part of a community is very relevant to face these hostile environments, and also to understand more clearly where to put energy, as Laura was saying before, whether we keep on trying to be there where values are so different, and how we instead build a different way of producing knowledge and bringing it to political resistances. I think building this community and keeping this community is very important. And I would like to end with a positive note. I'm based in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And here, I think we have good examples about how keeping on insisting and being creative and pushing and pushing and pushing worth it. In Argentina, the feminist economics agenda is very much now as a priority of the feminist political agenda. And talking about heterodox departments in Argentina, we are this year starting a new PhD program at a national public university, and I have been invited to co-coordinate that. And one of the main topics on the curricula is feminist economics. So it's just an example, it's a bit auto-referential, but just to say it's worth it, and to fight it really worth it. Thank you.
Oh, congratulations, Karina. How exciting. Jessica, I'm going to hand it back to you. I'm sorry, I'm a minute over time, but it was too exciting.
Thank you, Radhika. Yeah, very exciting indeed. Thank you so much to our moderator, panelists, and all of you for joining. And again, a special thanks to Mary for the initiative and the amazing organization. We heard really interesting insights today on how we can channel so much positive energy that is out there to bring academia and advocacy more closely together. As our panelists pointed out, IAFI is well placed to further advance these alliances and inspire action and help us tackle these potential tensions that James and Karina just summarized. I'm very much looking forward to next steps and see all of these ideas come to life. We will be sending you a follow-up survey so that we can hear from you how to best support this building bridges moving forward, and what you would like to see in our event series in the future. So please take the time to fill that out. And please look out for future online events in the series, Building a Career as a Feminist Scholar and Feminist Research Methods. Thank you all again. And as was just mentioned, to be continued in Geneva. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. See you soon.